Nature in Montreal lives in many places. It lives in the 1.5 million public trees that are in streets and in parks. These public trees are more numerous than people in Montreal. Nature lives also in a large array of parks. These parks total, there's 1,300 parks that occupy 40 square kilometers within city limits. But nature also lives in many nooks and crannies that are more difficult to account for. Among the more substantial woods, meadows, and wetlands, we estimate these areas to be about an additional 30 square kilometers that are largely outside the park system and in private hands. It is in these areas that the most pressing issues of conservation and biodiversity are raised. And this presentation will deal with how we have addressed these issues. In 2004, the City Council adopted this policy, and it strives to really protect and conserve our natural heritage within an urban development context. The objective of the policy is to protect 6% of our land mass. That excludes our water mass. We have a large bodies of water, and there's many protected areas in that, and that kind of throws people off. So I'm just staying with the land mass. And we'd like to go from 3% to 6%, and we define protected areas in terms of areas that are eligible for IUCN consideration in one of the categories. City Council allotted $36 million to do that, but we know that if we were just acquiring property, we would need 10 times that amount, so that was not going to be the solution. Really, we have to find creative partnerships with landowners and try to leverage a number of different tools in order to do this, whilst keeping in touch with the original intent of citizens that were pushing for this policy when it was adopted. The underlying premise on this policy is that it's possible to use the added value that is created by protection of biodiversity and of natural areas on the adjoining lands and use that, try to tap that value to economically justify the protection of the more important ecological areas. And I'll come back in the end a bit to this kind of our premise that verified. Rather than going through all the objectives and sub-objectives and doing, I thought maybe I'd try to, in the interest of time, going right directly to the lessons learned and the key strategies that I think were more successful in implementing this strategy. The first one is the invention of this word, eco-territories, which really took on its life on its own. And I'd like to explain what that means and how it was used. The second key element is the introduction of an ecosystem model, or a model of what does it mean when you're talking about a sustainable ecosystem. Trying to define that a little bit. The third element is the idea of integrating urban development into a conservation project rather than integrating some green spaces as an afterthought in a urban development project. Finally, it's process. Very important. I think a lot of people have mentioned this already, but setting up a consensus planning process that really is nourished by mediation theory and a number of fields. Eco-territories were delineated in a very simple fashion. We mapped out our remaining wooded areas. We added to that the open field of meadows, and then we had the wetlands and the hydric network of a watershed. And then we also look at what do we have now. It's the existing parks and green spaces. And we then delineated what amounts to about 90% of the natural areas that we have in Montreal. These areas are not protected areas. Eco-heritage does not mean that we're protecting these areas. It means these are where the difficult choices will need to be made. This is where the arbitration between development and conservation needs to happen. These are the areas that we're focusing on. And these eco-territories were then, there was an ecological profile for each one of these. This is a few slides that show on the ground what an eco-territory looks like and what kind of situation you have. So different eco-territories. I'm not going to go through all 10 of them, but just as an example, there's 3 of them that are shown here. So you see that there is some built-up areas in there, but it's really places that are being reconfigured, places that are where things are moving. These eco-territories were then profiled. Each eco-territory was studied, and we did inventories. What was there? What was the profile of each one? And for each, and then we identified objectives, management objectives for each one. These profiles and the objectives was a chapter in the municipal master plan, and then it becomes citywide objectives. And that's where really things started to pick up quite a bit. But there is no legal constraint associated to that, but it's a clear understanding this is a municipal objective, this is what we want to do in these areas. The second, so that was really the first key element. The second element is creating a model, an ecosystem of ecosystem sustainability. What does that mean? You have to understand that we're dealing with multi-million-dollar development projects that we're trying to push around, and we have to have a good justification in order to be able to explain why we need to protect these areas and they can't be developed. They like the idea of being next to the park, but could it be a bit smaller so that I could have my section in there? So it's an incremental kind of problem. So we need to draw the line at some point. So how do we draw the line? This is the model. We first of all identify core zones, areas that have the highest biodiversity. And these, by studies, we say, okay, these are the areas that are the most interesting. And then we identify buffer zones. Buffer zones play 2 roles. They as the word explains, it's a buffer between urban use and these core zones, but it's also often feeding grounds for the species that are within the core zones. And then the concept of corridors. These is really basic things. I think everybody uses them, but from a planning perspective, this is kind of new, and for developers, this is quite novel way of seeing things. And it was a way of establishing kind of a relationship that, yes, we have a sewer system and we have a transportation system and but this is an ecological system. So we got to integrate that into planning now. This is a new thing. So it gives us more of an even keel with the many other competing uses that need to be integrated into planning. This is an example of application of the model for Mount Royal. Mount Royal is a very significant symbol of Montreal, and there was a lot of controversy. Groups were saying, no more, we don't cut a single tree on Mount Royal, we're not going to do anything. And people who own it, mostly institutions, universities and hospitals, saying, hey, wait a minute, this is my land, my mission is not to conserve green, my mission is to educate or help people, and I can't go along with that. So we were called in to try to establish what is the conservation project, and we applied our model to this mountain. So we identified the core areas, and then the buffer zones. In this context, buffer zones are not very large, but that's all we could muster in this circumstance. And then we applied the corridors. What was novel about this is that there's a lot of green areas within Mount Royal that weren't included in the biodiversity project. And there's areas in the corridors that are actually parking lots right now. And we think we should be greening that. So that's kind of a whole flipping the whole issue around into a system. So in the long term, this is the system we need to put in place for Mount Royal. And that was well understood, and it very quickly created consensus around what we need to do in terms of biodiversity for Mount Royal. Just in passing, there's cemeteries at the summit, well, in that area, and we included that as well within the project. Moving then to the third key element, integrating urban development projects to conservation initiatives. This, I'm taking an example of another eco-territory. Is this a pointer? Yes. So I just push on the button. Okay. So in this eco-territory, we delineated a conservation project. And we know that there's going to be a lot of development happening all around that. And we've trying to explain to developers that it's worthwhile them ceding the land to us because they'll be next to this big project and their land will be worth more. So this project, there's a few projects, 3 larger projects here. This one is underway and construction is about to start. And we were able to secure 180 hectares of land from private developers for about 1/5 of the market value. So that explains a bit of how we could make our dollar stretch through these kinds of justification. And at the same time, for the city, the fiscal potential of the city is not hampered by this project, and they feel it was kind of a way of reconciling the yin and the yang of most cities. The third element is setting up a consensus planning process. And this, a bit like what was mentioned in Stockholm, is the idea of having a plan and getting everybody to agree on a plan is an important aspect. And we've developed what we call the concept plan for each eco-territory. And the ambition is that we have this concept plan adopted for each one. We have, so far, I think we have 3. And we're working on 2 others in the coming months. The first step to this process is sharing knowledge from different vantage points. So, not only having a good knowledge, ecological inventory and knowledge of the situation, but also confronting that knowledge to land use, to infrastructure, drainage, and transportation issues. And we get the engineers in and the different stakeholders, landowners and conservation groups together and doing the joint fact-finding, which is so important in the mediation process. And then we go from that to, once we've agreed on the facts, we try to identify the problems and the criteria, the problems we want to solve and the criteria for a good solution. I would say we're never going to agree on a solution if we haven't agreed on the problem. That's a very important step. Then exploring options, looking at different ways we can integrate all these requirements and packaging solutions that help everybody feel that this is a win-win as much as that can be possible. So the preliminary concept plan is then drawn up and presented to public consultation. But before I go there, I'd just like to mention that in this process, we understand cultural values come into play there, and sometimes people bring in things that weren't really part of the agenda when we started, but we feel that we need to deal with that. In this case, there was a Haut-Champagne, which is an area which is more agricultural. People say we want to keep the rural character of our borough, and we want to maintain agricultural activity here. And now we're looking into having something which we call paysage humanisé. What does that mean?
Human-dominated landscape.
Yes, and see if we could use that category 5 kind of system for. So the process of engaging citizen participation in this is really pushing us in new directions. Now, once the public consultation and we have agreement on this plan, and then it is formally adopted by the different agencies involved in actually implementing it. And we have boroughs and the city council and getting all that done. So that's the last part. To date, we've, on our 6% objective, we're at 5.3, so we're moving along, but we haven't finished yet. We got over 30 conservation projects that are still in the works. As I said, 3 concept plans. I would say globally, the underlying premise verifies. We've established through studies that some of the projects we worked on sold 7 times faster than all than all the competition. And these are land assessment evaluators that have put this in. I also understand that developers use the added value created by being adjacent to parks in 3 ways. They use it to increase density without losing their client base. They use it to speed up sales, and they use it to increase prices. So there's a combination of that, which depends really more on the business plan than anything else. Where we've kind of hit a snag, and I think I'd like to mention, is that a lot of land that aren't development cities belongs to institutions. They belong to corporate, to crown corporations or different organizations that are linked to government and have conflicting missions with ours. And often the bitter fights have been with public or public-related lands, for which all this tool really is less pertinent. So that's the issue. Maybe in closing, I'd like just to say, I was listening this morning, and perhaps I'd say that we're very proud to be part of the URBIS initiative. And I think the things that perhaps from a practitioner's point of view would be the most useful for us now is recognition, but on a credible recognition. It has to mean something. That would help us maintain the momentum on what we're doing and maybe innovate. But that recognition is going to be based on realities. I think good science is also important. I think it would be really interesting to be able to move forward on ecological model and have something a little bit more sophisticated, to be able to really try to work on that a little bit more, and to monitor sustainability of the ecosystems that we're putting in place and adjust that. And I think ecological services and documented ecological services, whether it be economic or more functional, I think would be very useful as well. So that's it. I could mention that we're working on more concept plans, but we've been involved in the City Biodiversity Index, and we went to a public scrutiny on the whole policy a few months ago. And people are saying, well, this is great, you've done a great work, keep going, but can you come into the central core? The eco-territory doesn't really work in the central core, so now we're trying to invent things that we can do in the central core, and that involves mostly greenways and doing things that using biodiversity to enhance urban landscapes in smaller contexts. And we're also working on the tree canopy objective. That is another new thing. So that's it.